Hi everyone, today we're going to do the cardiovascular system. Now today's lesson's a little bit long, so make sure that you are following along, you're listening to the video, and you're asking questions if you do get stuck on anything. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with physiology of circulation. The first things we're going to talk about is pulse, and then we're going to get into blood pressure. So pulse and blood pressure, two of the things that we're learning about, is something known as a vital sign that is typically taken whenever you go to the doctor's office. That is, they check your pulse, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate to make sure that you're breathing okay and you're getting enough oxygen, and typically your body temperature to see if you have a fever. Arterial pulse, which is known as a pressure wave, is created by the alternate expansion and recoil of an artery that occurs with each beat. So as blood gets pumped out, arteries must expand to make sure that they can take that pressure that is being pushed out of the heart, and then they recoil once the blood has passed and has gone to the rest of the body. Now, oftentimes your pulse rate, or the number of pressure surges you have per minute, is going to equal your heart rate, which is your beats per minute. Usually that averages to be about 70 to 76 beats per minute whenever you're at rest for a healthy person. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to always be between those two values. You may have a lower pulse rate or you may have a higher pulse depending on your body situation, because pulse can be influenced by activity. So do you exercise a lot, or do you have a very sedentary lifestyle like I do? Postural changes. Are you sitting up? Are you laying down? And even if your emotions, are you very stressed or are you pretty relaxed? So you can feel a pulse in any artery that lies close to the body surface. All you have to do is press that artery against a firm tissue. Now, these places that you check pulses are also usually known as pressure points. They're known as pressure points because these points also can be compressed to stop blood flow to any of your distal tissues like your arms and legs in case there is a significant blood loss or hemorrhage. So if you have extreme blood loss going on because you have cut your hand open, usually if you compress your brachial artery, which is your artery up in your arm, it's going to stop blood flow, and so you won't bleed out to death. Hopefully you didn't slit a major artery, but you won't lose as much blood out of your hand. Now, a common pressure point that we usually take pulse is your radial artery, which is taken right there at your wrist, but you also usually take it up in your carotid artery, up in your neck. You can also take your pulse as well. This image shows a lot of basic places where you can take your pulse. You have your superficial temporal artery, facial artery. Common carotid is one that most people use as well. You have your brachial, radial, femoral, popliteal, posterior tibial, and dorsalis pedis artery. So how do you check your pulse? Well, all you do is take two fingers, usually your first 2 to 3 fingers on one hand, and you lie it over the artery. Do not use your thumb though, because it actually has its own pulse. When you take those 2 to 3 fingers and you press them against the artery, you want to press firmly, and then you want to ease up on that pressure once you find your pulse. And you're going to notice that there's a regularity and strength to that pulse. You can feel it beating. Then you begin counting. Depending on where you've learned how to take your pulse, you can count for 30 seconds and multiply it by 2. You can count for a whole 60 seconds. Some places only count for 15 seconds and then multiply that number by 4, as long as it adds up to a minute. Okay. So that's all about pulse. If you had any questions, make sure that you ask me, or you can go ahead and open up your textbook. But right now we're going to move on to blood pressure. So blood pressure, there's two distinct things about it. One, it is the pressure of the blood exerts against the inner walls of the blood vessels. So the pressure pushing against the vessel walls. And blood pressure is actually the force that keeps blood flowing through the blood vessels even when the pressure surges have stopped. So how does that actually work? Well, blood pressure actually works against a gradient, high pressure versus low pressure. One thing to know about pressure is always going to travel high to low. When your ventricles contract, blood is actually forced into the large, thick wall elastic arteries closest to your heart. So it's going to appear first in your aorta. From there, blood is going to flow along a descending pressure gradient, which means it's always going to keep going from high to low pressure. That means that pressure decreases as blood flows through your blood vessels as the distance from the heart increases. Now, when I say distance from the heart, remember that blood only travels one way. So notice that in veins, it's going to go back to your heart, and since it's getting closer to your heart that way, you're going to think, oh, well, pressure is going to increase again. That's not the case. When I say distance from the heart, I mean how far has it traveled, and not necessarily in actual distance. So don't get that confused. In case you did get that confused, I would actually start this part of your notes because this explains pressure is high in your arteries, lower in your capillaries, and they're actually lowest in your veins, even though they are returning to your heart. In fact, your superior and inferior vena cava that these dump into your right atrium actually have the lowest pressure. Okay. So over here, this picture shows your aorta has the highest pressure. Then your arteries, your systemic arteries, the pressure decreases a little bit. Your arterioles still have pretty high pressure, but it's still low. Capillaries, it's even lower. Venules, veins, and then the lowest is your vena cava, so your superior and inferior. Now, there are differences in blood pressure, and you can actually notice this whenever you cut either an artery or a vein. Veins, if they get cut, blood flow is even from the wound when cut. When arteries are cut, there's usually rapid spurts of blood. The reason is arteries are under very high pressure where veins aren't. If you're going to get blood drawn, blood is always drawn from your veins. Now, continuous blood flow absolutely is going to depend on the stretchiness of your large arteries and their ability to recoil. And this basically properties of arteries is what allows pressure to be exerted on blood as it flows. So that elasticity or that stretchiness of that tunica media, so again, I'm going to write up here, that's found in your tunica media layer, is extremely important. In fact, when your arteries start to harden, as in arteriosclerosis, this is where you have lost that elasticity. And so blood doesn't pump as well, and your blood pressure can actually fall. And that affects blood flow. Let's go on to talking about measuring blood pressure. There are actually two arterial blood pressures that are measured. The first one is your systolic pressure. This is pressure in your arteries whenever your ventricles contract. And your diastolic pressure, this is pressure when your ventricles are relaxed. In other words, they're not pumping blood. Usually your systolic pressure is always written over your diastolic pressure, and the unit for it is millimeters per mercury. So you might hear a number if you go to the doctor, 120/80. 120 is your blood pressure whenever your heart is contracting. Diastolic, that's your pressure in your arteries or your veins, basically your blood vessels whenever your heart is relaxed. Usually they use an Oscultatory method, which is an indirect method of measuring your blood pressure. And usually they do it on your brachial artery. So let's go through the steps of how they take your blood pressure. Here we have your brachial artery in your arm. And we're going to assume that this person's going to have a blood pressure of 120/70 for a young, healthy person. What they do is they usually put a cuff over your arm, and here they inflate the cup. This is going to be it's going to be right above your elbow, and they're going to pump it up where they actually cut off blood flow to your arm. And when they listen, they cannot feel a pulse in your lower arm. Then what they do is they gradually release that pressure in the cuff, and they're going to listen. What they're going to listen to is when they start to hear a soft tapping sound. That's the first sound they hear. This tells them that a small amount of blood is actually trying to get through that constricted artery down to their lower arm. When they hear that sound, they're going to record that as your systolic pressure, which here they heard it at 120. They're going to continue reducing that pressure until that sound becomes loud and more distinct. And then when the artery is not constricted and blood flows freely, that sound is going to disappear. When that sound disappears, they record that as your diastolic pressure. And here the sound disappeared or was no longer able to hear it at 70 millimeters of mercury. So normal human range is variable. Usually your systolic pressure ranges between 110 and 140, and your diastolic pressure is between 70 to 80. However, blood pressure varies from one person to another. Nobody's is exactly the same. And this actually cycles over a 24-hour period, peaking in the morning. This is when, if you have high blood pressure, they tell you to not seek a doctor, because what is normal for you might not be normal for another person, and what's normal for them isn't normal for you. So when we think about blood pressure, we have to take into account a lot of different things. We have to take into account how it can vary with age, how much you weigh, what race you are, what mood you're in. Are you very stressed? Or are you a very calm person? Physical activity. Do you exercise a lot? Or again, do you live a sedentary lifestyle where you sit in front of the TV a lot? And even your posture. Now, if we talk about variation in blood pressure, you might hear different words like low blood pressure, high blood pressure, and what does that mean? If you have low blood pressure, this is known as hypotension. This means your blood pressure, your systolic pressure, is below 100 millimeters mercury. This can result due to individual differences, and this may be no cause for concern, especially if you are very, very fit or you have been physically conditioning through running or other types of aerobic exercise. If that's not the case, and this can't be explained due to physical conditioning, this can hint at poor nutrition, and it means you have inadequate levels of blood proteins or you have low blood viscosity. Your blood is very liquidy, it flows very easily. Acute hypotension is actually a very, very big warning sign of circulatory shock, which means that your blood vessels are not filling and blood is not getting to the rest of your body normally, and this could be a result of blood loss. On the other hand, instead of low blood pressure, you might have high blood pressure. Now, a brief elevation of blood pressure is actually normal, especially if you're running a fever, if you have just got done exercising, or if you're emotionally upset, such as you're very angry, or you just got scared, the heebie-jeebies out of you. High blood pressure is known as hypertension. So remember those words hypo and hyper. So hyper means high. Think if you have a lot of sugar. This hypertension is defined as if you have a sustained pressure of 140/90. And this actually warns that there's an increase of peripheral resistance, or there's friction happening in your blood vessels that can strain your heart and actually damage your arteries. So they want to make sure they keep down your blood pressure down to a normal range so you don't stroke out. So what are other things besides age, weight, gender, physical activity that affect your blood pressure? Blood pressure is directly affected by your cardiac output and your peripheral resistance. So let's go back over what cardiac output means. This is the amount of blood pumped out of your left ventricle per minute. And peripheral resistance, we just hinted at it, it's the amount of friction that blood has as it goes through your blood vessels. Now, we've talked about cardiac output and what affects it, such as heart rate and stroke volume, but let's delve deeper into what does peripheral resistance means. Peripheral resistance can actually be increased if there is constriction of your blood vessels. So constriction means that they are tightened or they become smaller. Also, if there's an increase in blood volume, or if there's an increase in blood viscosity or the thickness of your blood. In other words, blood pressure is cardiac output times peripheral resistance. So what are some things? Let's talk about it. Neural factors. Your autonomic nervous system actually plays a pretty big part in your blood pressure. Now, when we talk about your autonomic nervous system, we are not talking about your parasympathetic division. This actually has little to no effect on blood pressure because they don't affect your blood vessels. In opposite, your sympathetic nervous system actually has the biggest effect on your blood vessels and on your blood pressure. This actually promotes vasoconstriction, so which means your blood vessels are narrowing and becoming smaller. This actually increases the blood pressure. If you think about it, if you poke a little hole in something and you squeeze it, water comes out really, really fast. But if you have a big hole in it and you squeeze it, yeah, water's going to come out, but it's not under as high as pressure. Vasoconstriction occurs in several different situations. For example, if you stand up suddenly, you have all the blood that was pooling when you were laying down start rushing through your body. And so in order to make yourself not dizzy, your body constricts those blood vessels so that your blood pressure can kind of go back to homeostatic stasis. The vasoconstriction can occur during hemorrhages because they want to narrow those blood vessels so not as much blood is getting to the rest of your body, and severe dehydration. Vasoconstriction also occurs whenever you exercise for all different parts of your body except your skeletal muscles. So we don't want as much blood going to our extremities or to our stomach for digestion. We want to constrict that, and we want to divert all that blood down to our skeletal muscles because that is what's being used when we run. One thing to know is sympathetic nerves can never constrict or narrow the vessels in your blood of your blood in your heart or your brain, because your heart needs that to keep pumping. You don't want to narrow those. And your brain, you always have to have oxygen and everything to your brain. You never want to divert blood. So those blood vessels are never going to be constricted. There are also renal factors. Kidneys play a super big role in regulating your blood pressure by altering your blood volume, or basically the amount of water that is found in your blood. If blood pressure is too high, kidneys release that water and reduce your blood volume, and they release it by making you pee. If blood pressure is too low, kidneys are going to send out a signal to release something called renin. This causes angiotensin II to form, which is a vasoconstrictor, which is going to narrow your blood vessels. Now, angiotensin II stimulates the release of aldosterone, which makes sodium, so this is supposed to be sodium, to be reabsorbed by the kidneys, and therefore water is retained. So I would say here you have water retention. Water stays in your body. Temperature also has an effect. If you are very hot, you're going to have a vasodilating effect. Blood vessels are going to become bigger, so you can release the heat that is being trapped within your blood, and this actually decreases blood pressure. And then cold has a vasoconstricting effect because we don't want to release that heat, and that increases your blood pressure. Funny thing is your blood pressure is typically higher in the winter because of that cold than it is in the summer. Other things like chemicals are going to have an effect on your blood pressure. Epinephrine increases your heart rate and your blood pressure. It gets things pumping, it gets things moving, like an EpiPen. Nicotine also increases blood pressure because it causes vasoconstriction. But alcohol and histamine has the opposite effect. This causes a vasodilation, and it actually decreases your blood pressure. And the last one we're going to talk about is diet. Diet most people commonly believe that if you have a diet low in salt, saturated fats, and cholesterol, this prevents high blood pressure and prevents you from getting hypertension. So they're always looking at those cholesterol levels, the HDL and LDL levels, so good and bad cholesterol levels within your body. And this is a summary of factors that help increase blood pressure, or do they decrease them? Here they tell you your initial stimulus: decreased blood volume, exercise, posture changes, chemicals such as renin, nicotine, and increased blood viscosity. All of these are going to increase or stimulate blood pressure. So that's the end of the lesson. Let me know if you have any questions. I know I did that a little bit fast. If you need to go back and rewatch any part of this lesson, make sure that you do so. And I hope you guys have a good day.